In the days when kingdoms measured their strength by the treasuries they kept, there lived a steward named Josiah who oversaw the household of a wealthy merchant in Damascus. The merchant, grown old and weary from years of trade, had decided to test his servant before granting him authority over greater riches. Josiah had served faithfully for 7 years, tending to the daily affairs of buying and selling, managing the servants, and keeping careful records of grain and silver. His master watched him closely during these years, noting how the young man handled each responsibility placed before him. The merchant's wealth was considerable, stretching across multiple trading routes, with storehouses filled with precious goods and fields that yielded abundant harvests. The opportunity before Josiah was clear. His master had no sons, and whispers in the household spoke of the steward being named as heir to the entire estate. The merchant himself had begun to speak of retirement, of passing his knowledge and wealth to one who had proven worthy. Josiah could see the path laid out before him, a future where he would command vast resources and hold influence throughout the region. For months, everything proceeded according to this promise. The merchant gave Josiah increasing authority, allowing him to make decisions about purchases and sales without consultation. The household prospered under his management, and neighboring merchants began to treat Josiah with the respect reserved for men of substance. The steward felt the weight of approaching wealth and began to envision how he would expand the business once it became his own. But within Josiah's careful management lay a flaw that seemed insignificant in those prosperous days. When recording transactions, he would occasionally round numbers in his favor, taking small amounts that he told himself would never be missed. A handful of silver from a large sale, a measure of grain from an abundant harvest. The amounts were tiny compared to the wealth flowing through his hands, and he reasoned that his faithful service earned him these small rewards. This practice began as rare occasions, perhaps once in a month, when Josiah felt particularly deserving. But as his authority grew and the prospect of inheriting the estate seemed more certain, these small takings became more frequent. He told himself that soon all of this would belong to him anyway, so what difference could it make? The merchant was old and paid little attention to minor details, trusting his steward completely. Josiah developed careful methods for his secret taking. He would alter records slightly, mixing legitimate expenses with his personal withdrawals. He created false entries for supplies that were never purchased, services that were never rendered. The amounts remained small individually, but over months they accumulated into a sum that would have fed a family for an entire year. As the merchant prepared to announce his decision about inheritance, he chose to conduct a thorough inspection of his accounts. This was not born of suspicion, but simply the prudent practice of a careful businessman who wanted to understand exactly what he would be passing along. He called for all records to be brought before him, every transaction documented and explained. For 3 days the merchant studied the books while Josiah waited anxiously nearby. The old man's experience with numbers was sharp, despite his age, and patterns that seemed invisible to others stood out clearly to his trained eye. Small discrepancies appeared, amounts that did not align with his memory of major sales, expenses that seemed unusual for their timing and nature. On the 4th day, the merchant called Josiah before him and spread the records across the table. Without accusation or anger, he began to point out each irregularity he had discovered. One by one, He traced the false entries and missing amounts, his finger moving across the parchment with the precision of a man who had built his fortune on attention to such details. Josiah stood in silence as the full extent of his deception was laid bare. The merchant's voice remained calm as he calculated the total amount taken, a sum that represented not just silver stolen, but trust betrayed. The steward realized that every grain of wheat, every coin he had taken, had been noticed and remembered by the man he thought too old and trusting to keep careful watch. The consequence came swiftly but without drama. The merchant dismissed Josiah from service that same day, providing him with wages owed but nothing more. Word of the dismissal spread quickly through Damascus, carrying with it the reason for the steward's fall. Other merchants, who had begun to view Josiah as a future partner, now saw him as a risk they could not afford to take. Josiah found himself without employment and without prospects. His reputation, built over 7 years of apparent faithfulness, crumbled in a single afternoon. The wealth that had seemed within his grasp vanished completely, replaced by the reality of a man who must start again with nothing but the knowledge that his character had been weighed and found wanting. Days passed in solitude as Josiah walked the streets of Damascus, observing the business that continued around him without his participation. In this quiet time, understanding came to him not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual recognition of what had actually happened. He saw that his testing had not begun when the merchant opened the books for inspection, but had been ongoing every day he had access to the household's wealth. Each small theft had been a test of his stewardship, and each one had revealed that he valued immediate gain over faithful service. The merchant had not trapped him or set a snare, but had simply watched to see what Josiah would do when given authority over resources that were not his own. He understood then that nothing had been taken from him in haste, and that the moment of inspection had come only after many quiet days of access. He saw then that greater responsibility would have rested on the same habits he had already allowed to form. The truth had been revealed before greater responsibility had been placed in his hands. In the weeks that followed, Josiah began to rebuild his life according to this new understanding. He found work as a simple laborer, loading and unloading goods at the marketplace for daily wages. The work was humble compared to his former position, but he approached it with complete honesty, counting every item carefully and reporting exactly what he handled. When merchants offered him opportunities to skim small amounts or overlook minor discrepancies, Josiah declined without explanation. He found that honest work, even at a modest level, brought him a peace that his secret taking had never provided. The anxiety of being discovered was gone, replaced by the quiet confidence that came from being exactly who he appeared to be. His reputation slowly began to change among those who dealt with him regularly. Merchants noticed that goods handled by Josiah were never short, that his counts were always accurate, that problems never seemed to follow in his wake. Eventually, a spice merchant named Benjamin approached Josiah with an offer of regular employment. Benjamin had heard the story of the steward's fall, but had also observed his subsequent conduct. He needed someone to manage a small warehouse, someone who could be trusted with valuable inventory. The position offered modest wages, but the possibility of advancement based on proven faithfulness. Josiah accepted the work and applied himself to it with the same careful honesty he had practiced in the marketplace. He counted every sack of pepper, every bundle of cinnamon, recording each transaction with precision that went beyond what was required. When customers brought complaints or disputes, he investigated them thoroughly, always ensuring that any errors were corrected in favor of honesty rather than profit. Benjamin watched his new employee carefully, not with suspicion, but with the attention of a man who understood the value of character in business. He saw that Josiah handled small responsibilities with the same care he had once given to large ones, and that the steward's approach to work had been fundamentally changed by his experience of loss. After a year of faithful service in the warehouse, Benjamin began to give Josiah additional responsibilities. He was allowed to negotiate with suppliers, to make decisions about inventory levels, to represent the business in minor transactions. Each new level of trust was tested thoroughly before being expanded, but Josiah proved worthy of every advancement given to him. As his responsibilities grew, Josiah discovered that his former desire for wealth had been transformed into something more sustainable. He no longer dreamed of sudden riches or inheritance, but found satisfaction in the steady growth that came from faithful stewardship. The money he earned was modest, but it was truly his, earned through honest work and given without reservation. Years passed as Josiah continued to serve Benjamin faithfully, and his reputation for honesty spread throughout the merchant community of Damascus. Other traders began to seek his advice on difficult transactions, knowing that he would speak truthfully regardless of personal advantage. His influence grew not through accumulation of wealth, but through demonstration of character. When Benjamin grew old and began to consider the future of his business, he faced the same decision that Josiah's former master had confronted years earlier. But unlike that previous situation, this time the testing had been ongoing and thorough, observed over years rather than discovered through investigation. Benjamin knew exactly what kind of man Josiah had become, because he had watched the transformation happen day by day. The inheritance, when it came, was not given as a reward for past service, but as a recognition of present character. Josiah received the spice business not because he desired it, but because he had proven himself capable of handling it responsibly. The wealth that came with ownership was no longer the goal, but simply the result of faithful stewardship practiced over time. Under Josiah's leadership, the business continued to prosper, but in a manner different from his earlier dreams of expansion. He grew the enterprise carefully, always ensuring that growth came through honest dealing rather than clever maneuvering. When opportunities arose to take advantage of customers or suppliers, he declined them, choosing sustainable relationships over immediate gain. The wealth that accumulated in Josiah's hands was held differently than he had once imagined holding riches. He understood now that he was still a steward, responsible not to an earthly master, but to the principles that had restored him after his fall. Every transaction was conducted as if it would be inspected, every decision made with the knowledge that character was being tested daily. Other young men came to work in Josiah's business, and he watched them with the same careful attention that Benjamin had given him. He saw in their eyes the same hunger for advancement that had once driven him, and he observed their handling of small responsibilities to understand what they might do with larger ones. When he found those who proved faithful in little, he promoted them. When he discovered those who could not be trusted with minor things, he released them before they could cause greater damage. Through these years of stewardship and observation, Josiah lived as though each day might be weighed as carefully as the first. Every day brought new opportunities to prove faithful or unfaithful, to build trust or destroy it, to demonstrate worthiness for greater responsibility or reveal unfitness for what was already given. The testing was not a single event, but a continuous process that shaped both the steward and what he was permitted to steward. In his later years, Josiah would sit in the courtyard of his warehouse, watching the flow of business around him, and remember the moment when his former master had spread those records across the table. He understood now that the merchant had not been punishing him, but teaching him, showing him truths about stewardship that could only be learned through experience of both failure and restoration. The wealth that surrounded him in his mature years was held with open hands, managed carefully but not grasped possessively. He had learned that increase came not to those who desired it most strongly, but to those who could be trusted with it most completely. The inspection of his stewardship continued daily, not through the examination of books, but through the testing of his responses to responsibility. When young merchants would ask Josiah about the secret of his success, he would speak not of strategies or opportunities, but of the importance of being faithful in small things before seeking authority over large ones. He would tell them that wealth was not a prize to be won, but a trust to be maintained, and that the inspection of stewardship was not something to be feared, but something to be welcomed as protection against the corruption that comes with unchecked power. As the sun would set over Damascus, casting long shadows across the marketplace where he had once loaded goods for daily wages, Josiah would reflect on the path that had brought him from disgrace to restoration. He understood that both his fall and his rise had been necessary parts of a larger education, teaching him lessons about character and stewardship that no amount of success without testing could have provided. The merchant who had dismissed him so many years ago had died in peace, knowing that his wealth had been protected from one who was not yet ready to receive it. Benjamin, who had restored him to responsibility, had seen his trust rewarded by faithful stewardship. And Josiah himself had learned that true wealth lay not in the accumulation of resources, but in the development of character worthy to receive them. These are the chronicles of wealth, not as men desire it, but as it is formed.